Hello, my name is Daniel Schoonmaker, and I am the Executive Director of West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum. Thank you for joining us for our third Legislative Forum on Resiliency and Sustainability in Michigan, today featuring 3rd District Congressional Candidate Peter Meijer. For those that are not aware, Michigan Sustainable Business Forum is a project of West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, working to promote business practices that advance climate leadership, community resilience, social justice, and the creation of a circular economy in Michigan. This is part of a project that we've been working on with support from the Environmental Defense Fund in partnership with American Sustainable Business Council and others to elevate the need for public sector leadership to protect our communities and economy from present and emerging threats, and to provide an opportunity for our current and potential elected representatives to hear about these concerns from impacted businesses and community leaders. Specifically, we are interested in how we can invest in climate resiliency and racial equality and how COVID-19 can inform those efforts. Our panelists today include Congressional Candidate Peter Meijer, Wendy Randall, Director of Kent County Essential Needs Task Force, Anna Jose, Program Manager for West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And I'll note, Anna, thank you, Anna, for joining us on late notice. She is an emergency substitution for a panelist that was not able to make it today due to unforeseen circumstances. And finally, Adam Bird. No, not finally. Adam Bird, owner of Bird & Bird Photography. And last but not least, Marta Johnson, of the American Sustainable Business Council. The next hour is going to go by pretty fast, and we're really looking forward to this discussion. I'd like to now turn the screen over to Mr. Meijer for some initial remarks.
Thank you so much for everyone for kind of joining today, and thank you for having me out. I know we had a good introductory earlier, and Daniel, just appreciate kind of all the work you guys are doing to make sure that we're all looking at these issues in a holistic way. I'm Peter Meijer. I'm the Republican nominee for Congress here in West Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. Our district focuses around Grand Rapids and Battle Creek. We have most of Kent County, and then all of Berry, Ionia, Calhoun County, and then a sliver of Montcalm County. So, we don't have the lakeshore, but obviously we're we have a strong and vibrant agricultural sector within the district. And, as all of us in Michigan feel, the Great Lakes and the environment are essential to our identity. I mean, it's right there in our state's motto, if you seek a pleasant peninsula, look about you. And I want to make sure that, our federal government is taking a leading role in making sure that we are addressing long-term issues of sustainability and resiliency. And also that, within our local economy, where you're going to see those impacts most directly and feel those consequences most directly, that we have community leadership that is, adopting those same kind of forward-looking vision. So I look forward to the discussion today, and I'm grateful to be here. Daniel, I think you're muted.
Did it myself. Auspicious beginnings, and we are grateful for you taking the time to be with us during this busy season. To start us off, I'd like to turn this over to Wendy Randall of the Kent County Essential Needs Task Force, and she's going to share how the pandemic has impacted Kent County's under-resourced communities in terms of essential needs.
Thank you, and hello everyone. The Essential Needs Task Force is a collaborative convening group working directly with organizations who are providing direct service, organizations who are funding services, as well as community advocates in areas of essential needs. What we've seen in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic is that organizations are not only struggling with providing operations in a manner in which there's safety for both their employees and volunteers, as well as those receiving services, but they're also struggling with the mental health and trauma that exists because of the situation, the health situation, as well as the racial climate around them right now. And in addition, they're experiencing an increased need and a heightened awareness that the need is very disproportionate in terms of the impact on people of color. So we are recognizing that we're recognizing that there have long been disadvantages for communities experiencing food insecurity, lack of transportation resources, housing instability, and disparities in their economic outcomes because of their employment status. But we're also recognizing that there's an increase now in the impact that's happening in the community. So there are not only more people experiencing need, but the negative impact of that need is more greatly impacting Black individuals and families, Indigenous peoples, and other peoples of color. So we're seeing a really heightened impact in each of these areas where organizations need to partner effectively in order to share resources and to make sure that they're providing those resources to community members in a way that is not creating duplication, but is really getting at those who need it the most, recognizing that the need is so great at this time. A question that I have for you is really around the federal government that's appropriate and necessary to help support these structures of essential need. So if you could please tell us how we can improve leadership from the federal government to ensure essential needs are met in our local community.
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, if we look to Washington, D.C. to solve every problem, we're going to be waiting way too long, and the problem is probably not going to be addressed in a way that's going to be most effective to solve the underlying issues. I mean, we are obviously, and we within the context of kind of those issues that you were talking about, you're hitting on so many different buckets of need, and you mentioned kind of the challenges around duplication of services. We see all too often between state and federal approaches to an issue that is impacting a locality, not only the risk of a duplication of effort, but then, if nobody actually owns the problem, it's impossible to hold ultimate long-term accountability. I'm a strong believer in subsidiarity and pushing decisions down to the lowest level within an organization, in this case within the government, because I think the city of Grand Rapids is going to be a lot more effective at addressing an issue that the city of Grand Rapids is dealing with than the state of Michigan, or than the federal government. So how do we create that more responsive structure? It's going to be not, taking a Hail Mary approach, not putting all your eggs in a federal kind of DC bucket, but also making sure on the flip side that the federal government is creating a very effective long-term approach so that state and local governments are able to have a sense of expectation on what the federal government's role is. If the state of Michigan is unsure, where the federal, infrastructure investment priorities are going to be, then that's going to create some instability on their own ability to plan. And if the, states has instability on their long-term investment planning, then what does that do to the county level officials who are trying to make those decisions? And what does that filter down to the, city level officials? So bottom line, I want to see the federal government take a much more, concerted role on planning for the long term. This obviously dovetails well with issues of climate and the environment, planning for the long term, but then also where you have intervention, carefully looking at, what those impacts are. Is the initial impetus for that intervention, that policy, that regulation, that law, is that something that's measurable? Are we taking a period of time to measure that impact? Are we assessing the efficacy of that involvement? And then are we, making a change going forward to figure out if that needs to be modified, extended, canceled? The more that we have, a federal government that, takes a very attention deficit approach to, solving issues, the harder it's going to be to ultimately solve that issue, because, there's not going to be any long-term accountability. So, I think we need to make sure that the federal government isn't creating any disincentives, and that they are taking a supporting role. But again, recognizing that the most detailed impacts are going to have to occur, at the level closest to where that issue needs to be addressed.
Thank you.
Thank Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Anna Jose of the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And she's going to share how the businesses she works with are experiencing difficulties trying to run a business during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how it has been especially hard for businesses led by people of color.
Thank you so much, Dan, for giving me the opportunity to participate in this event. Thank you, Carissa, for reaching out. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thanks. Right now, I'm really excited about all the things that you guys are doing, but the reality is that a lot of our businesses are struggling in ways that we have never seen them struggle before. And the reality is that now more than ever, we need all the help that we can actually get. And the reason I say that is because we have businesses, people that have been in businesses for years, and now they're going to see themselves closing their doors. And as a representative of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, we want to make sure that we, make sure that those businesses stay open, because if we don't do that, a lot of our families and our people of color are going to suffer because of this. So one of the things that I've seen, businesses are struggling in different ways. Right now, they are seeing themselves, not only thinking about themselves or thinking about their employees, but they're thinking about their families, they're thinking about their mental health has been affected by this. And I just want to know exactly, what is the position? What is the position out there, or what are some of the things that we could actually do to help some of these businesses of color stay in business and then just move forward? One of the things that I could say right now, we really working diligently in making sure that a lot of our businesses, they understand what is needed. They need funding. That's one of the biggest things, and we have been working extremely hard in ensuring that they get funding. Although that has been very difficult for them to get funding, because it seems like when we get any money from the CARES Act, it's extremely hard for it to get to the Latinx community, people of color. And I just want to know and get a clear understanding as of how we're going to move forward in ensuring that all the businesses are going to be supported equally.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I heard from a lot of smaller businesses and kind of entrepreneurs of color was the challenge with accessing some of the PPP program funding and some of the small business administration lending facilities, that because the legislation kind of got passed in a rush, and then you had a lot of folks trying to jump in that line, and it was bankers in the local banking communities that were the ones administering that. There was a strong bias towards customers who were towards the best customers of the bank, and so that tended towards larger businesses, putting smaller businesses, putting the smaller restaurants, putting kind of those entrepreneurs of color at a disadvantage relative to kind of the ironically the businesses that were already more well capitalized to begin with and probably had more of a cushion. I think this is one of those challenges that we need to make sure that we have stronger kind of financial support and kind of small business administration support mechanisms for entrepreneurs in minority communities, so that we are kind of allowing and making sure there isn't that disparate impact on economic opportunity. I was talking to a local entrepreneur saying, it was easier for him to get a $60,000 loan to buy a car than to get a $30,000 loan for his business. There is a market inefficiency around that sort of initial capitalization. And frankly, if it's that much harder for you to start a business, it's that much harder to kind of escape a poverty trap. It's that much harder to be able to grow and employ folks in a community, and that much harder to ultimately, bring more prosperity to areas that have seen chronic underinvestment, going back to racist red line policies in the 1930s around kind of home mortgage issuance by the federal government. So I think the short answer there is increasing small business administration loan facilities, but also making sure that there's a correction for the inherent bias against smaller businesses when you're relying on the existing banking structure to be the one processing those loan applications.
Any other further thoughts beyond how to support this business community beyond access to the funding structures?
Well, I do have a question. What would you think from a messaging standpoint should be done to give people more confidence to engage in their local economy? It's been made pretty clear it doesn't matter whether the economy is open or closed. What matters is whether or not people feel safe. So do you have any ideas on things that you think are important we should be doing so that people can feel more safe?
And you're specifically referring to COVID kind of feelings of safety, right? That component?
I am, but this does, the same question sort of does apply to climate change. As we see increasing instability across essential systems, we're going to run into the same messaging problem.
Yeah.
And so I'm assuming.
If you wouldn't mind, Adam, if we could we put that in the parking lot and come back to it? And Mr. Meijer, do you have anything further to say about how the federal government and how you would advocate for businesses led by people of color?
I mean, we already have kind of supportive when it comes to contracting structures and sort of preferential processes in place on that. Again, I'll kind of come back. You bet. One of the things that I'm a very firm believer is that, I want decisions to be made at the lowest level possible so that those decisions are most responsive to the needs of the constituents. So oftentimes that means if it's, trying to make sure that if it can be solved at the state level, make sure the federal government may be providing support, but isn't necessarily dictating the terms. It can be solved at the city level, vice versa for a state involvement. That doesn't mean that I don't think that our representative shouldn't be a community and shouldn't be looking to, not necessarily in an official, this is the federal government saying it policy, but taking advantage of the microphone, taking advantage of the bully pulpit, taking advantage of the ability to shine a spotlight on issues impacting the community so that solutions can be found. If there's a community on one side of the country as a planning solution, talking with our representative and sharing a solution, rather than again putting all the eggs in a basket of trying to get this thing passed through in a omnibus appropriations bill at the end of the year that may or may not get stripped out in some committee. So again, this is where I want to make sure that our community has the resources needed without putting in a position where it's dependent on an unstable, at the moment, unstable reliance on federal resources.
Thank you. Now, and we'll come back to Adam's question in a minute, but first I wanted to give him an opportunity to kind of share his story alongside as we move into a more general discussion on preparing for the next disaster for a business perspective. I'd like to again introduce Marta Jones of the American Sustainable Business Council, who's going to share her experiences working locally and nationally with businesses to highlight the need for action on various issues, including climate change and racial inequality. And Adam Bird of Bird & Bird Photography, who will share his experiences as a business impacted by the pandemic. Marta, you go ahead.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I have the distinct honor of doing the Michigan-related work and collaborating with folks in different states, and especially with our DC team at the American Sustainable Business Council. We've been heavily engaged not only in pandemic responses with sustainable businesses and local businesses of a special concern in safe reopening. I can put a link into some of the working group outcomes for local, state, and federal recommendations that can align having safe reopening and a pandemic-friendly business response, as well as upholding sustainable business practices that we see broadening prosperity and growing and innovating our economy. We also are very active on climate change, especially at the federal level, and to a certain extent within states as well, and looking at opportunities around carbon pricing. I can put some links in on more information on our work and some of the proposals around carbon pricing, but also in carbon sequestration and improving the resilience and sustainability of our food systems as an important strategy, not only to help solve climate change by sequestering carbon in the soil, but also improving our stability and access to food and addressing food insecurity for our country as well. We work on transit and other issues as well, but we're extremely focused on making sure that climate change is at the top of the priority list, because we see it as a key opportunity for us to innovate and grow our economy.
And Adam?
So I'm the stereotypical small business owner. There's, 4 of us full time. Since COVID-19, we're down about 74%, 75% of where we were this time last year. So I'm working, but the other 3 people aren't. It's been particularly challenging, partly because of the lack of messaging and the lack of strategy. It's been difficult to determine what resources we need to try and access and leverage, because like with our PPP loan, I'm getting weekly updates from my banker telling me that they're still not entirely sure how we apply for grant forgiveness or not, and what that looks like or not. And I had to personally guarantee that loan, which then was used just to cover payroll for my people until one of them, after waiting, I think 4 months, finally got unemployment. So navigating these systems has been really difficult, but the COVID really kicked down the wall between politics and business and private life. It's been difficult for us to really make any plans going forward, because there's no unified messaging around the problem around COVID. Like we'll hear one thing from one body of government, and then we'll hear something from somewhere else. And it's made things very difficult for us to navigate. We're resourceful and we run our business very conservatively, so we're still around and we'll continue to do so. Peter, I'm going to just bring up that question I just asked again, since it's my turn. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think getting back to what we were tabling earlier on sort of that, I wrote it down as consumer confidence, but that can be a little bit misleading, because even before we saw, I like the framing of kick down the wall between, the government, the private sector, and sort of the personal social. Even before we had lockdowns and government mandates against, or government capacity restrictions on restaurants, you saw restaurant traffic start to drop, right? Just because a restriction might be lifted doesn't mean that we're going to go back, or we shouldn't have the expectation that we're going to go back to that same level, because that consumer perception of safety, that consumer degree of confidence is still going to be impacted. I mean, our economy was running, very red hot. Our government spending was, reaching $1 trillion deficit. And that was when, things were great. I mean, that was a boom time that was not sustainable. Obviously, before there was the inevitable macroeconomic correction, we had the pandemic that kind of forced us into that recession. This is going to be something that we're going to need, again, the government to be providing what it hasn't necessarily been providing, which is that long-term strategy, that long-term confidence. You mentioned the uncertainty around PPP loan forgivability. I'm reminded of any number of regulations where there is tremendous amount of uncertainty, and that uncertainty adds a cost to you, that adds a cost to the consumer, that adds a cost to a business, because risk it's a cost that has really no benefit. Unless you're speculating and you like to gamble, that risk is something that you're just having to, bake into higher financing costs, that you're having to make more conservative long-term projections that may be capping your upside in that long term. I mean, this is again where having a mismatch between, well, just frankly having an unstable kind of governmental structure and a lot of instability between the state and federal governments is putting us towards this end. None of us know what the future is going to hold here. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave. We don't know, what the second and third order, political agreements are going to be on additional CARES or stimulus or what have you restrictions. And the more we rely on the government to be providing that, stability, the more we're opening ourselves up to the inherent volatility of our political environment at the moment. There's no real solution to this, right? I mean, this is not something that any singular government policy is going to fix. The best solution, and where I've seen the most effective things occur, has when we've been seeing private sector cooperation at the lower level, has been where the government is providing that liquidity buffer and that at least degree of financing predictability, but that can only be short term. I mean, that was what PPP was intended to, but a lot of the initial loan recipients, when PPP was, several weeks, and you weren't even legally allowed to open under state level government restrictions, it was kind of a cushion that only got you so far, and then left you in the same place that you were before. These are unprecedented times, and what we need more than anything is just a governmental structure that's going to be responsive to evolving needs, rather than setting out one course of action, having folks plan and predict along that course of action, and then inevitably having to change it, when circumstances, dictate. So again, this builds towards my argument of the more we can have, and we saw this with some of the CARES funding allocation that I think was a stronger benefit, was pushing the decision-making down rather than having federal level means testing, allocating down to lower levels of government that could, again, be much more accountable to where those dollars are going at the end of the day. So more federal support of our local level. If there's going to be additional kind of federal stimulus on sort of the business side or liquidity on the business side, making sure that's working with representative organizations within that business community to allocate that capital in a way that is going to provide more stability, not less. And then if we're waiting on sort of very specific restrictions and language out of DC, trying to change that is going to take months, if not years, rather than being able to call up, the local board of a Chamber of Commerce, rather than talking to a county commissioner or a city commissioner. The more we can be empowering those lower level governmental authorities, the more responsive the solution is going to be.
But I want to follow that up for just real quick though. As a small business owner, my ability to conduct business is going to depend on testing and PPE. And right now, states and counties are competing with each other because the national strategy for testing is to do as little testing as possible. There's no cohesive, no one is looking at these resources and is coming up with a plan on how they get distributed based on need, based on anticipated need. And we have a playbook for this, the pandemic playbook the CDC built. Do you think we should, is this a blanket statement you're saying that everything needs to be done at the local level, or do you recognize that certain shared needs like testing and PPE
Absolutely.
really need a national strategy for distribution?
You look at anything that's dealing with national defense and resiliency, and you can't, kick militias down to a city level or else it'd be utter pandemonium and chaos. There's areas where we need a cohesive national strategy. And we've seen, very early missteps in a federal government structure around testing that was too consolidated and didn't take advantage of allocated resources between public sector at a local level, between universities, between private sector testing facilities. That has gotten a little bit more distributed, but it's been, again, a moving target throughout. Now obviously we've seen in the changing of CDC guidance right now a lot of uncertainty. We've seen uncertainty on the PPE provisioning side early on whether or not to adopt mask usage, and in a contrast between what has been international standards in some localities versus CDC recommendations. There are plenty of things we're looking in the rear view. We should have done them differently on this pandemic response. I will be very blunt and honest about that. Again, I view a lot of these as consequences of generational bipartisan failures to make sure that we have strong functioning institutions at the federal government, rather than very risk averse, very slow to adapt, and just not maybe good for setting long-term policy on some issues, but just atrocious at adapting to expedited and expedient emergent crises as we've seen here. So, I mean, we need to continue investing strongly on the pandemic response side when it comes to testing. I'm very optimistic at Operation Warp Speed and some of the advancements on the vaccination front. I think there's now 3 vaccines that are in phase 3 trials and may be cleared by the end of the year for broader use. Because frankly, that's going to be the only thing that's going to get us to a point where we're not in this continuing moving needle between, flatten the curve versus the bounce back we're seeing on the education side. Kids go back to school. Now there's an outbreak. Now they go back home. There's, a 2-week gap. They go back. I mean, again, we are not in a position where we're able to plan for the long term until we have a vaccine and then a testing regimen that's able to be more focused on the populations that need it once there is a broader vaccine that's available. And when we have the delays that we're having right now on the vaccination side, with some places taking up to 5 days, you may get the COVID test, but by the time you get those results, it's not helpful to be able to track and trace, given the amount of time and the lag, and given, what we know right now about the maximum periods of contagion for those individuals. So again, we're always just kind of chasing our tail until we get that gap down and until we have more effective, testing that is readily available.
I might jump in here really quickly. I'd be interested in kind of setting to a climate change question. At the American Sustainable Business Council, we're very interested in a wide variety of proposals that relate to climate change. And I'm interested in what you see the role of federal government in responding to climate change, and if there are any specific types of policy proposals you're interested in taking some leadership on if elected.
Yeah, I think where the federal government needs to be doing is, as we've been talking about kind of more broadly, is setting that vision and setting those parameters, and also accounting for how we got to the place we are right now. What are the combination of subsidies, of penalties, of regulations, of kind of research that have created some beneficial aspects around renewable energy and the expansion of solar and wind? Where have we seen potentially negative consequences in terms of subsidizing some carbon-based fuels? We know we're going to need, specifically focusing on the energy mix, we're going to need some on-demand generation, whether that is nuclear, whether that is natural gas. That needs to be a part for the foreseeable future. We also need to be focusing on more efficient battery storage. We need to be focusing on more efficient energy distribution networks and how that grid can allocate capacity between demand and generation peaks during the day or across geographies. That's where the federal government setting that overall structure, so that again we are aligning on long-term priorities. That's where it's really needed, and frankly, on the research and development side as well. Just about every revolutionary technology, has had some degree of federal investment on the front end, so that it's lowering the risk adoption for the private sector, and then you can have, that greater capital infusion. That's not, the taxpayers taking a gamble, but it's making sure that we are, creating a more efficient long-term market. So, if I were to boil it down in a nutshell, make sure that we're not currently pare back a lot of the structures that are distorting the market at the moment and moving us away from what I think is frankly the long-term kind of economic benefit, which is making sure that we are heading towards a more sustainable future, that we are heading towards a more resilient economic mix, that we're not creating areas of vulnerability around either, a excessive, as we're seeing kind of in California right now with some, I would say, smart in the long term, but not as smart in the short term, energy mix adoption that risks kind of poisoning that well, and folks feeling like they can't have a sense of trust and security in that energy component. Again, this is why I love talking at length, but it's hard to kind of boil it down because we're talking about so many different areas. But we were talking about kind of circular economies. How do you make sure that you are reducing that carbon footprint of an industry by having production and consumption be as closely tied in with the locality as possible? we were talking earlier about trying to reduce construction costs through the adoption of mass laminated timber, which can be both a carbon sequestration method that can take place within the state, and also work to address high price per square foot of more dense construction within urban areas. How can we make sure that all of that is tying together and aligned? I mean, that's going to require institutional bodies within our government that are beyond politics and that are focusing on long-term solutions that are rooted in observable, accountable, factual outcomes, rather than getting subjected to a political system that is going to be inherently subjective.
Thank you so much, Peter. Do we have any follow-up questions from anyone on the panel? I think Wendy and Anna, you both indicated you had a follow-up question.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Peter, I wanted to go back to some of the discussion that was taking place around safe employment and small businesses and really supporting small businesses. One of the things that we've seen, of course, with the support to workers around the pandemic is the additional unemployment supports, which have been, of course, extremely helpful to keep the economy moving, as well as to support households as they were struggling with their income during this time. I have a question related to business supports and how there's alignment with small businesses and their ability to maintain their workforce, while knowing that their workforce has to cover really sporadic and expensive childcare costs right now, as well as recognizing that the unemployment benefits that many were receiving were double, if not more than double, the minimum wage in the state of Michigan. And how do we really support workers going back into the workplace and support those small business owners when living wages is closer to $20 an hour than it is to our minimum wage of $10 an hour?
Okay. If you could give me an hour, I would love to dive into 15 different parts of that, but I'll try to keep it as concise as possible. So first, on the front end of kind of the living wage, and just about every issue we had, every issue we had prior to COVID made it far worse, right? I mean, if we were heading in a wrong direction before, it cut the brakes and put a brick down on the gas, right? Our kind of cost of living expenses are a huge component of that. You look at the inflation over the past 2 decades of healthcare, housing, and education costs, and it is plainly unsustainable. And that, of course, is impacting folks, who have the slimmest discretionary income margin, throughout. Those are also areas that have seen the highest degree of government regulation and subsidy, which I don't think is a coincidence in driving up costs over the long term. But that's a topic for a longer discussion. But how we can make sure that, I've been critical of the unemployment assistance because of the perverse incentive it's been creating in some scenarios. I'm much more supportive of just direct cash payments that are not, means tested through trying to go through our current broken unemployment systems. The reason why we had a $600 flat amount across the country is because all of our state level unemployment systems, the majority of them are based off of the COBOL programming language that was built and created in 1959 during the Eisenhower administration. And there's 200 people who actually know how to code in that, and probably 100 of them are below the age of 70. Right, so we have a real mismatch with just a circumstance that requires a flexible, adaptable government approach hitting up against the reality of a lot of very decrepit, underinvested infrastructure when it comes to how that government processes. So that's, you have some places that have up to $1,200 of unemployment assistance in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and then you have some states in the South that are $200. Right, so the federal government's approach was trying to level out for that. What I strongly disliked about it is you were then inadvertently penalizing, some folks who had essential jobs, who had to go back to work, and putting them at a disadvantage relative to folks who could, who had a more flexible employment structure. And why I'm far more supportive of, if you're going to give those types of assistance, give a flat rate, give it across the board. Folks who are maybe on the upper income, they're going to pay that back in taxes. Right, but this way you're at least kind of creating that cushion so that you are able to kind of compensate for both the economic impact of the consumer confidence, as Adam was talking about, and that sort of consumer safety, while at the same time compensating for the government imposed components of that lockdown, which again, were varying from state to state to state. Now, the kind of broader question and where those obviously come together on the shifting employment side, I've been really proud to see a lot of partnering at the local level between especially the hospitality and the restaurant industry, and folks that say, hey, we have a lot of folks that, we know we're not going to be able to, reopen anytime soon. How do we partner and kind of share at the HR level, at the administrative level, so that those folks can essentially be cross-leveled into other businesses that are seeing an increase? Obviously, our family runs a chain of grocery stores. We were seeing a demand for kind of greater labor. That was able to be accomplished, and we were able to find ways of effectively employing folks and making sure that you were at that community level kind of buffering for the volatility in the unemployment market. But that also doesn't address that longer term challenge of cost of living increases, and where when it comes to healthcare, housing, and education, those are going to be very different solutions across each, but we need to be making sure that, that a consumer-driven economy is going to quickly, seize up. And when we don't have consumers, we're able to have discretionary spending. I mean, that has been a huge challenge that we definitely don't have time to go more in depth, but just whether it's, stagnated wage inflation on the one side, or those increasing cost of living items, specifically in those buckets between healthcare and housing and education. We need to be making sure that the federal government isn't inadvertently making solutions harder to find and raising costs through, among other things, creating regulatory instability from businesses that are trying to offer more efficient and more cost-effective solutions.
Thank you, Peter. And Anna, you had a follow-up question, right? I muted you earlier because we're getting some background noise.
No, that's fine. That's fine. One of the things that I do want to ask is, based on the situation that our businesses are going through, what the federal government and what Mr. Meijer is thinking that will be best, what processes and systems will be best to put in place that will help a Latinx community at large right now?
I'll be very honest. A lot, and I probably should have said this at the very beginning. I would love to, obviously I'm here to kind of answer questions. A lot of these are areas where, folks on this panel have far more experience, far more knowledge, and far more of an understanding of what is needed for that community than I'm going to, just by virtue of kind of my experience. So I want to say from the outset that, I would love to hear what, you think are the ways that we can be, reforming processes and systems to help the Latinx community. That's an area that, I don't have deep personal experience, but want to make sure that where the government may have a role, that it's, listening to folks who have the greatest depth of knowledge and have, seen what has been effective and seen what hasn't been effective.
One of the things that we have seen, Mr. Myers, is that our Latinx community has been left out. We have been left out, and to be honest with you, and to be extremely transparent. And in terms of processes and procedures that have been put in place, there's a lot of inconsistencies with those processes and procedures in terms of COVID-19. And it seems like we are not given, and we're not asking for full priority. And our community is not being seen like other communities are being seen. And I know that we are pushing and we're trying to make the difference, to make sure that these businesses stay open. And it seems like we're not getting the help that we need. And that is a little bit, in all transparency, that's a little bit frustrating for us, because these businesses, they have been doing business for years, and now it seems like we are not doing enough to make sure that they stay afloat.
I guess I should clarify. I mean, I guess my question is specifically to the Latinx community, maybe relative to the African American entrepreneurial community in town. Are there issues that are not, necessarily shared by other small businesses or by, small business entrepreneurs that may be specifically impacting the Latinx community? Because
Go ahead.
yeah, because it seemed when you're talking about the inconsistent approaches that could be, applicable in all of the different within many other communities within West Michigan.
Yes, they are. They are. And I think I'm losing you right now.
Yeah.
I
think
I'm losing connection.
yeah, Peter. Unless you have any kind of further thoughts, that it seems like maybe an issue we can loop back to later and get some more specificity on some of the concerns that have been highlighted as a follow-up discussion.
Yeah,
I'd like to open.
Again, I mean, I guess kind of more broadly speaking, there are, where it may be an issue of unequal economic access or unequal economic opportunity that may be cutting across demographics versus where that may be concentrated within a specific community. That's where, I've talked to many, small business owners throughout the community, African American entrepreneurs, Hispanic entrepreneurs, and I'm very open to, but all of those individuals are speaking from their own experience, and as representatives of a broader body, want to make sure that I'm expanding those inputs so that it isn't limited to one person's experience.
Great, and I think we may have lost her. Oh, she's still there. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience now. Lionel Legrone, are you still there? You had asked a question earlier, and I'm going to give you the ability to talk if you'd like to ask your question.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
So my question is, what we learned from COVID is that globally we are inextricably linked. What's happening in China affects people in Nairobi, Kenya, and it affects people in Grand Rapids. Yet there seems to be a rift between our country and the international organization that's charged with the task of monitoring these pandemics. And I'm wondering, what is your take on re-engaging the World Health Organization and other organizations that monitor these pandemics and other health issues national in scope, so that the next time there is a global outbreak, we can react to it more swiftly? What is your position on engaging or patching up that relationship with the WHO?
Yeah, I'm supportive of trying to correct that relationship. I've worked with, my background is in humanitarian aid and disaster response. I've worked with the WHO in Afghanistan, where they were working on a few different vaccination efforts. I think they can be complementary to what we're going to be doing, and we need to have international level cooperation. I don't want us to be dependent because those are entities that are not, that are, as any institution, as any bureaucracy, is going to be a little bit limited and also very risk averse. And we saw in the very early days of the WHO engagement, a lot of international political factors coming into that mix that I would much rather we also have. And this has been the other component of my background is from working in military intelligence in the Army. I've been very disappointed by our intelligence communities kind of focus on, fighting the previous war rather than taking a broad-based approach on better understanding the threats globally. If you look at what the impact of COVID has been, both in lives lost and in, economic terms, I mean, this has been, outstripping many of the conflicts we've been involved with. You look at what our national security investments have been for the past couple of decades around global health, around pandemic preparation, around making sure we are increasing and viewing our domestic health system as part of that resiliency component as sort of national priority, and it just hasn't been there. So I mean, I'm very supportive of working to reform the WHO and making sure that it is upholding the high and important task that we have assigned to it and that the global community expects from it, while at the same time making sure that we are building up and strengthening our domestic capabilities around pandemic preparation and surveillance. But I think your point is very apt in terms of we see in COVID how and we also have the environmental kind of climate change tie-in that we may be a country that has oceans to the east and the west, but we are inextricably linked to not only the global economy but also the global health environment and also to the global environment. So that's not something that we can just choose to pull up the drawbridge and isolate ourselves from, but something we need to be engaging in a very strong and long-term way.
Thank you, Peter. I'm gonna give Clarissa Mata a chance to talk. Clarissa, are you there?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So hi, Peter. I heard earlier that you said something along the lines of, there's no need to panic and act as if our planet is gonna die in 10 years. If we don't panic and act like our planet is dying, because newsflash it is, then we won't have time to save it at all. If we don't act fast, then we will reach a point where we have done so much damage that it will be irreversible and that our planet can die in the decade following. So my question for you is, do you support the Green New Deal and promise to help it get passed on the Congress floor to ensure that generations to come, including your children and grandchildren, will live on a clean, green Earth?
No, I do not support the Green New Deal. And I'm going to push back on kind of that framing. The alarmist, the alarmist mentality, if we're still alive in 10 years and we were saying 10 years ago that we're all going to be dead by now, then we lose credibility on that argument. When we focus on the fact that yes, there are human impacts that are impacting our climate, we are seeing increasing weather volatility, we are seeing increasing severity of weather and kind of climatic events, and that is something that we need to be doing everything we can to start to make sure that again that we are not we're correcting for a lot of those long-term trends that have led us to this place. My biggest pushback on the Green New Deal is the way in which it uses environmental concerns as sort of a cloak to mask a lot of underlying societal restructuring. Now, we probably have very different opinions on the utility of those underlying restructuring components, but that is not, I am not a believer that if we were to shift to a more, I'm not using the word socialist here in a disparaging way, but in a kind of away from a free market kind of capitalist system, I'm not confident that that would lead us to a point where we are in fact reducing emissions, where we are able to kind of sustainably over the long term be better stewards of our environment. Looking across the world, some of the worst pollutant emitters do not have, are not capitalist systems. Some of the countries that are most sustainable and are protecting their environment in the best, most long-term fashions are those that are more aligned along free market principles. So when it comes to the broader economic kind of structural question, I think the Green New Deal gets it wrong. When it comes to the realization that we need to be trying to live more sustainably, trying to do everything we can to make sure that our federal government is supporting long-term sustainable initiatives, that is something that I'm fully supportive of. But I have no confidence that the proposals in the Green New Deal fully fleshed out are going to actually get us to a place where those aims are being met in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Matthew Van Sweden. Matthew, go ahead.
Hello. My question is regarding kind of airborne pathogens. I think we know that they aren't going to go away. And we know that three elements of vulnerability to these infectious diseases are first, exposure to the vectors and disease-carrying agents. 2, sensitivity to climate change and its health effects, and 3, adaptive capacities of communities. You know, we know climate change affects the first 2, and kind of local politics and national politics affects the third, and then what kind of is umbrella over all of them is the built environment. And so my question is really about your position on using this moment to invest in a transition of our local built environment to support and enhance individual and community health and well-being.
So, you know, if I can, I think, touch upon 2 factors there, and please let me know if I'm kind of missing any out. But to me, the 2 most relevant areas of the sort of built environment are, you know, not only the quality and the, you know, efficiency of our kind of housing stock, and making sure that you're doing away with some of the longer term, you know, whether it's lead paint, whether it's asbestos, some of those environmental hazards that are embedded within that built environment. And then on the other side, worrying about particulate matter, you know, fine air pollution, I guess, both on the kind of production side from a, you know, pollutant emitter on the industrial capacity area, and then also on the vehicular component with greater electrification. Are those, am I right in kind of interpreting your question? You're looking for my approach on those 2 areas? When you say built environment, Matthew?
Sorry, yeah, I think in general, I'm a practitioner in the architectural engineering space. And so I know that, you know, the built environment, we spend 90% of our time indoors, and it affects us individually and collectively. And, you know, looking at historic environmental injustice, you know, affecting Black and brown communities, they have kind of the most historically underinvested real estate assets. And those are the most unhealthy spaces to live in, to perform business functions. So, you know, understanding that COVID is affecting, and airborne pathogens are affecting the most vulnerable amongst us, and our immune systems have a direct response to our built environments. And so it feels like now is a good time to kind of focus on both the things that you're mentioning, you know, the producers, where these you know, toxins in our environments are being produced from, but also the kind of locations that we occupy, and kind of investing in infrastructure improvements to ensure the spaces that we are actually healthy and provide or promote healthy immune responses to things like COVID into the future.
Yeah, and obviously we've seen sort of that that overlay with the, you know, underlying respiratory comorbidities, which are more prevalent in urban areas for a number of reasons, including kind of that fine air particulate pollution, and, you know, which is partly automotive exhaust, partly kind of industrial, you know, contamination and clean air issues that are, you know, fully within the mandate of the EPA, and that we need to be continuing to reduce down that particulate fine air pollution. Specifically on the kind of built environment side, I mean, this is where, with the International Building Code and some of the state and local code adoption, there's been a tension between long-term energy efficiency and kind of insulative, you know, properties and what our values demanded, a tension between that, and then making codes so expensive to comply with that if you have substandard housing stock that is, you know, not been invested in, it's harder to replace that or to upgrade it because of that threshold of specifically kind of rehabbing a lot of the, I would say, give or take, 1880 to 1920 balloon frame housing construction that we saw proliferate across the Midwest, and that, you know, today is more concentrated in minority communities. So we need to make sure that we are having a supportive environment at the federal level where we are adequately weighing what those risks and those benefits are, because it'd be far superior for health outcomes and for energy outcomes to have sort of halfway steps where you can be both improving the energy efficiency of a home, so decreasing the cost, the utility cost of that homeowner, while at the same time effectively removing some of those environmental contaminants and creating a more dignified and a more safe living environment for folks in that community. You know, striking that right balance. because when we have the current code regulations right now that do not have that degree of flexibility, or where local level officials who are applying it are not, creating kind of room for that flexibility, you're kind of trapping, high construction costs and a lower quality existing housing stock. You're trapping a lot of people in just the perpetually same, more environmental from a health standpoint scenarios. So we need to be making sure that we are at the federal government level not getting in the way of that, and working to find, what are some of those low cost but high impact solutions that can be upgrading that housing stock, while at the same time, balancing health needs, for folks within those communities with our long-term kind of environmental sustainability goals. And that's where I'd love to see more federal government research, just on sort of the practical application end, and then more certainty on that governmental regulatory end, because at the end of the day, it's all going to come down to what that building inspector says, and making sure that those officials are empowered to be looking for creative approaches, while at the same time prioritizing health and safety. We need to get to that point, because a risk-averse approach and sort of business as usual is only going to kind of perpetuate a lot of the negative outcomes we have today.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. Thank you also, Wendy, Adam, Anna, Marta, and all of our attendees today. This has been a great discussion here. We have a few questions left unanswered that I think that if you'd be willing, we'd love to follow up with you, and specifically looking at the Paris Climate Agreement, carbon pricing, and I think you had some questions of your own that we might want to follow up on regarding how the Latinx business community is being impacted by the pandemic and other issues presently.
As a general rule, I think the role of the representative is also to be responsive to the community. It's going to be listening to that community input, identifying, folks who have specific competencies, who have specific experiences, and who can speak from that informed standpoint. Because there are a lot of areas that I have in my background, but this is where being able to kind of harness the best of the collective ideas and voices within the community is going to be important, so that our national legislation and federal priorities reflect that.
Thank you for your willingness to learn more. Again, thank you, everyone. This has been a great program, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for our next discussion with John Hoadley, who's running for a seat in Southwest Michigan. Again, thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you all so much for your time and your questions. Thank you.